Welcome to the show. Today is one of the more anticipated shows that I've looked forward to hosting and have the privilege of hosting. We have someone on the show who's going to tell a remarkable story of love, loss, and finding family. And normally on these shows, I give my opinions, I give my thoughts, I interject. But today I'm going to try to stay out of the way and let Debra tell her story. So, Debra, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, Devin. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you giving this opportunity to me and letting me tell my story.
Of course. You have a very compelling story and one that needs to be shared. Debra, if you don't mind, just sort of tell us your story and tell it the way you told me, because you have this way of telling the story in such a calm and soothing way. And if you could tell to the audience the way you told me.
If I can take you back to the morning of September 11th, 2001. It was a beautiful September day, and I was at home in Middle Village, Queens, with my 8-month-old daughter and my husband, who is a newly minted New York City fire chief. He had just been promoted and asked to be in the commissioner liaison unit for the fire commissioner of the New York City Fire Department. I turned on the TV that morning and I saw the first plane hit the first tower. And I ran into the bathroom to tell my husband, Tommy, a plane just hit the World Trade Center. My husband, on a fluke, had taken a day off. 2 of his friends had just retired from the New York City Fire Department, and they were going out to lunch. So my husband quickly called the chief of personnel at the New York City Fire Department. His name was Eddie Moriarty, and Eddie instructed my husband to go to the shops, which is fire department jargon for where they keep all of the rigs for the New York City Fire Department. I said, "Hon, I'm going to the shops, and then I'm going to the command center at the World Trade Center." And he gave me a kiss, and he kissed our baby Devin, and he ran out the door. It wasn't until the next day that I got a phone call from my husband. He had told me that he had survived and that he saw the second tower collapse right in front of him. All those hours, I didn't know what had happened. You know, our cell phones were out. I had no contact with him. And when he called me, he was putting together the list for the New York City Fire Department, which is now the 343 names of the members murdered on 9/11. I was on a maternity leave with the New York City Police Department. I was working as an undercover in the narcotics unit, and I was out on a maternity leave, and I was supposed to return to work on 9/11, but because we couldn't find a proper nanny, my husband said, take another week off. And I had gotten my paperwork changed to September 17th, exactly a week later. I immediately went back to work and went to the chief of personnel, and people within the department knew that I was married to a fire chief who was now down at the World Trade Center searching for the missing and the dead. And they put me in the narcotics division with the chief of narcotics, William Taylor. while I was working in the narcotics division during those weeks, I was assigning men and women of the narcotics division of the New York City Police Department to Ground Zero for the rescue operation at that time. During that time, I saw a woman that looked exactly like me. And being an adoptee, I had never met anybody that looked like me before. So it was quite startling to see a sergeant dressed in full uniform look like me. And I turned to one of my coworkers and I said, "My God, this woman looks like me." And my coworker turned to me and said, "Duff, she does. She looks like you. That's Sergeant Mary Young. And she lost two cousins in the Trade Center in Cantor and Fitzgerald. And the sergeant was going to their memorial. So I didn't approach her. But it got me thinking about my biological family and possibly that my birth mother could be at the World Trade, because the only non-identifying information I had for her was that she was a securities trader. And I started my search at that time for my biological family. We had a new Dell computer and I was able to start searching, and I had found search angels online that knew of Angel Guardian Home, where I was adopted from. And they began to help me. I found my mother, and I reunited with my mother, Maureen. And my mother said to me, "Deborah, your father has been calling me every year on your birthday for the last 30 years. And the last time they spoke, Charlie asked Maureen, if she ever gets in touch with you, please let me know." So Maureen had just moved and she lost Charlie's contact number. So I began my search for my father, Charles Sullivan. And it wasn't an easy one, because Sullivan is like Smith in so I started calling around Brooklyn, where I knew he lived, in Bay Ridge, every Sullivan in the phone book, until I found somebody that knew my family and said, let me see if I can contact him for you. And I waited, and I got a phone call one day from my father, Charles Sullivan. And Charlie said, "I'm looking for Detective Duffy." My maiden name was Duffy at the time. And I said, "Yes, this is Detective Duffy." And he said, "Wait a minute, Deborah? The only Deborah I know is my daughter." And I said, "Well, Charlie, I am your daughter." And it was very emotional, and it was a fabulous experience to hear his voice. And he asked me, "Do you know where Breezy Point is?" And I said, "Charlie, do I know where Breezy Point is? I have a cabana at the surf club in Breezy Point. And I was a 100th precinct rookie. Breezy Point was my sector. And in police jargon, sector means the area that you patrol." So he said, "Darling, you've been passing your family's house every day." So we quickly made plans to have a reunion. And I told my father, reunions are quite emotional. How many people are going to be there? And he said, "Oh, there'll be a few. So when he met me out in the parking lot of my cousin's home, he quickly brought me to a beautiful house overlooking the Manhattan skyline, where all of my relatives were waiting, the Sullivan Milano family, and my aunt and uncle were there. And they came up to me and they said, "Deborah, We lost our son, Patrick, and we lost our nephew, Peter Milano, in Cantor and Fitzgerald on 9/11. But now God has brought us your family, and they embraced me and my little family. It was just a very beautiful experience because these two people had witnessed their son perish in the collapse of the World Trade a year and a half prior. And then I got a thrill and I met my cousin, Sergeant Mary Young, that woman that I saw at One Police Plaza was my first cousin. So it's been a very, very emotional experience, but I'm very grateful to have met the Sullivan Milano family and be a part of such a wonderful, wonderful, caring, and a big Irish family.
I understand it didn't stop there. You actually found or met your extended family in Ireland. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The story doesn't end. Story went on, and a few years later, I made plans to reunite with my cousins, my second cousins, and my father's nieces and nephews that live in Donegal, Ireland, in Gweedore. And we are from a very small island called Gola. So shout out to my Irish family that will be thrilled that I'm mentioning Gola, which is an absolutely beautiful island off the coast of Gweedore.
Got it.
And they are warm and wonderful people. And they took me to our castle. We have a castle. The Sweeney clan has a castle. That was my grandmother's name, Mary Sweeney. And I was able to go to the castle with my cousin, Maren. And she told me that 5 of our chieftains are buried in the cemetery of Doe Castle. So it was just an enormous thrill from being an adoptee who didn't have, when you're an adoptee, you adopt other people's heritage. And it's just so very important to you to have your own. So it was just a thrill.
So you went from not knowing anything about your family or your background to learning about this rich history that you have.
Yeah.
And meeting family in Ireland. That's amazing. So how did it feel? How did it feel going from this, not knowing anything about yourself and who you are and where you came from to having such rich history and being tied to a country outside of America?
Devin, I truly believe that it's like a puzzle piece, and all of the puzzle pieces fit together, and it makes you whole when you find out your history. It really does. It's a thrill of a lifetime, and if you can do it, I suggest that everybody does it. You might be surprised at what you find, and thrilled all at the same time. We're all connected.
I want to unpack a couple of things you said. First of all, you were on maternity leave, right, in 2001, and you just had a baby.
I just had a baby.
And you were supposed to return to work on September 11th.
On September 11th, when you come back from maternity leave, you return at 7 a.m. or as we call it in the police department, 0700 hours, return to work to the chief of personnel's office to go back. And, like I said, I was having difficulty finding childcare, and my husband said, "You have the time to take more time off." And I said, "Oh, just take another week." And my paperwork is crossed out from 9/11 to 9/17.
And your husband took the day off as well, so he was home with you on that day.
Which is very unusual for my husband. He now has 40 years in the New York City Fire Department. He's a battalion commander, and it was a fluke. Two of his very good friends had
Let's talk about also your career choice, because here you are in the police force. And I want to kind of talk about that a little bit as well, because when you met your family, you found out that they too serve their country or serve their city in that way as well. So talk a little bit about your decision to become a police officer and a detective subsequently.
I think that when you make the choice to become a police officer, it's a choice made from the heart. You really want to help people, and that was my deepest desire, was to help people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the majority of police officers in the country, that is their deepest desire, is to help others. You did not sign up for the possibility of getting shot at unless you really have a deep desire to help others. And I had been a flight attendant prior to being a police officer. So I was flying around the globe, but I just had an innate desire to help people.
And if you think about that, so I really want your thoughts on this, because I'm sure you've had some time to think about it. You chose to be a police officer, and your family, whom you had no idea who they were, had no connection to them, was not inspired by them or influenced by them, joined the force as well. Why do you think that is? Do you think is it genetics? What is it about you two people, or people that are related but never came in contact with one another, chose the same profession? And such a unique one.
You know what? It is really it's an experience that it's a calling. And if you are choosing the New York City Police Department, you have a calling.
Mm-hmm.
I think only the special and the few answer the call.
Right.
And I just happen to have two in my biological family, plus my uncle, Pat Sullivan, who was a highway officer who lost his son in Cantor and Fitzgerald. So, I became part of the greatest detectives of the world. And that was my ultimate goal, was to become a New York City police detective.
Right.
And I'm very proud of that. I'm proud of the heritage that we have.
Talk about that, because you were in one division and you couldn't be a detective, so you had to get into another division. Is that correct? So tell us that story.
I began on patrol in the 100th precinct, but my ultimate desire was to become a detective. And the only route for a young, inexperienced officer to become a police detective at that time, I had that goal. It was to go and volunteer as an undercover. And the first undercover assignment that I had was in the Vice Unit in the Public Morals Lake Tour module, which was assigned to all 5 boroughs of the New York City Police Department. So as a very young officer, I volunteered to do that work. But at that time, you couldn't get the detective shield. You couldn't get that gold shield out of the Vice Unit. So I was only there for a 6-month stint. And I went back to command and I volunteered to become a narcotics undercover. And I went into the narcotics division in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which was Alphabet City. It wasn't as popular with restaurants. It was really the Lower East Side at the time. So I also had the experience of going undercover into bars and restaurants and clubs that were selling illegal substances to underage minors and teenagers. And I went into my famous case is the tunnel case, which ultimately was closed.
Got it. So you were a narc.
I was.
That's incredible.
My kids chagrined. But yes, I was. I'm very proud of that. Shout out to all the undercovers out there, because it's not a job for the weak of spirit.
I can't imagine. If you're just joining the show, I'm on live with Debra McCarthy, and she's sharing her amazing story with us. For those of you who are on, if you have a question for Debra, go ahead and type it in the comments, and we'll try to get those questions answered for you. You were also interviewed by People Magazine.
I was. My friend Casey Baker wrote a beautiful story, and you can read it in People Magazine. And I hope that your listeners and your viewers are enjoy it.
And you're going to write a book, or you wrote a book.
I did write a book, and I'm looking for a publisher and a literary agent. So if you have any in your viewing audience, send me an Insta. I'm actively seeking a publisher. There's more to the story, but you'll have to read the book.
This is just a teaser. How difficult was it back then for a woman to join the police department? I'm paraphrasing the question.
I'm going to give you a brief. On February 28th of 1994, it was one of the coldest days in the history of New York. And myself and about 2,000 others stood in line to become New York City police officers. But we had to stand there in the freezing cold for about 8 hours. And I was in heels.
Oh my God.
So that's determination.
You must have really wanted to be a police officer.
And I went back the next day. They tricked us and said, "Oh no, we're going to get you in the next day early. Don't worry about it." But I knew their tricks, so I wore a pair of construction boots under my and flannels.
How challenging was it for a woman at that time to become detective? And how many women detectives were there at that time?
You know what? At the time I was an undercover, there weren't many female undercovers. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would say there was only 2 of us in Manhattan South in the building that I worked in.
Oh, wow.
To one of my friends. And it was definitely a novelty to have a female on your team as an undercover at that time.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
We did a lot of cases, a lot of different search warrants and street buys. New York was different during those days.
Give us a case that kind of, I don't know, maybe get a lot of control, or get a little hairy at one point. Any examples of that?
I would say my first buy, it was a very big example of that. The very first buy that I did on the street, I was buying off of somebody that wanted to pull me more into the building. Mm. But luckily I had a seasoned officer working as my partner, or ghost at the time, and he came at the right moment and said, "Come on, we got to go. Just get your stuff and let's get out of here." But it later turned out that the person trying to get me into the building was a rapist and had done time for rape. So you had to keep your wits about you when you were working these kind of cases.
How supportive were your adoptive families? Is a question we have from the audience.
No, that's a tricky question. It
Okay.
waited a long time to do a search for my biological family. I waited until I was 30 because I was afraid of the reaction. But when I told the brothers that I grew up with that I was searching, they said, "We wondered what took you so long."
There's someone here that wants advice. My daughter wants to study criminal law. What advice do you have for her? Do you recommend that she does an internship, and if so, where?
I definitely recommend Malloy College. That's where I'm working right now. I work at a college for the School of Arts and Sciences at Malloy on Long Island, and we have a fabulous criminal justice program. And yes, I do believe that going into criminal justice, you should intern somewhere, and whatever school that you choose, make sure that they have a great program. I know that Malloy has one.
Perfect advice. Other questions you guys have for Debra McCarthy? Again, if you just joined the show, she's been sharing her incredible story about, someone who was adopted. And due to the events of 9/11, she was inspired to find her real family. And in so doing, found an extended family who welcomed her with open arms. So
Just have to mention that one of my lieutenants in narcotics went on to be the New York City Police Commissioner, Dermot Shea. But Dermot was my lieutenant in narcotics. So he was a fabulous lieutenant, great boss. We did a lot of cases together. So I have to give a props to the new New York City Police Commissioner.
got it. All right. Any other questions for Debra? All right. Debra, anything else you'd like to share with the audience that you haven't shared so far?
Yes, I'd like to share with the audience that I hope that my story inspires people and it gives them hope that out of tragedy, there is a silver lining, and that good things do happen.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Devin.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Your story inspired me when you first told me the story. I found it just incredible. And I feel privileged to have you on the show. I want to thank you for doing the show and sharing the story with this audience. And we're going to find you a publisher, okay, for that book.
Thank you, from your
Let's go.
Thank you.
Absolutely.